The unexpected crash. James had always dreamed of space exploration. He was a seasoned pilot, trained for every possible emergency, but nothing could have prepared him for this. His ship, the Endeavour, had been cruising through deep space when disaster struck. It happened without warning. A small, uncharted asteroid belt appeared on the ship's radar, too close to avoid. Before James could react, the Endeavour was hit by a powerful impact, shaking violently. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and the control panel went dead. James gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady the ship, but it was already too late. The damaged hull cracked open like a metal can, and in moments, the ship was tumbling uncontrollably through space. He fought to keep his wits about him. Come on," he muttered, trying to restore power, but it was hopeless. He knew this wasn't just a minor glitch. This was a full-on catastrophe. Panic gripped him as the ship started plummeting toward an unknown planet below. James scrambled for his seatbelt, securing it tightly. The ship spun faster, sending his stomach into his throat. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. He could only pray that he would survive the crash. The ship was falling faster and faster toward the planet's atmosphere. The heat from the planet's fiery surface began to burn through the ship's hull, and James could feel the pressure building inside the cockpit. The noise was deafening, like 1,000 metal plates being shredded. He was losing control. With a final, gut-wrenching lurch, the ship hit the atmosphere, breaking apart like fragile glass. James felt a sharp pain in his chest as the ship slammed into the ground, throwing him against his harness. His vision blurred as he blacked out, and the last thing he saw before everything went dark was the strange, uncharted planet below, a planet that would change everything. When James regained consciousness, the world around him was eerily quiet. His head throbbed painfully, but he forced himself to open his eyes. The ship's interior was a wreck. Control panels were destroyed. The dashboard was shattered, and smoke filled the air. The emergency lights blinked weakly, casting a dim red glow over the cockpit. He was alive, but barely. He unbuckled himself from the seat, feeling the sharp pangs of pain shoot through his limbs as he moved. "This is bad," he muttered under his breath. There was no way the ship was going to fly again. The emergency distress beacon was dead, and the communication systems were fried. He was stranded on an unknown planet, light years away from any civilization. His mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. He needed to find shelter, food, and water. But first, he had to get out of the wreckage. With great effort, James crawled through the broken ship, pushing away debris. He squeezed through the damaged door, stepping out into the unknown. What greeted him was something he never could have imagined. The landscape was beautiful, too beautiful. The sky was a deep shade of violet, filled with clouds that glowed like soft lanterns. The ground was covered with thick, lush greenery, and strange trees with enormous leaves towered above him. The air smelled sweet, almost intoxicating, like fresh flowers mixed with the scent of rain. But there was something off about it. It was too perfect. There was no sign of any life, no animals, no insects buzzing around. Just silence, the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. James carefully stepped away from the wreckage, scanning his surroundings. He had to stay alert. This could be a dangerous place. The longer he stood there, the more uneasy he felt. It was too quiet. Where was everyone? Was this some kind of deserted planet? The thought that this place might be abandoned set his nerves on edge. As he ventured further into the jungle-like forest, James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The trees seemed to shift and sway, almost as if they were watching him. His heart pounded harder, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. There had to be a way out of this. He had to survive. He took another cautious step, but then he heard something. It was faint at first, just a rustle in the distance. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He squinted into the dense foliage, trying to see if anything was moving. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. A woman. At first glance, she seemed almost human, but something was undeniably different about her. Her skin was a deep shade of green, with faint patterns running across her arms, and face like some kind of tribal markings. Her eyes, though, her eyes were the most striking. They were large, glowing a pale blue, with a depth that seemed almost otherworldly. Her hair was long and wild, cascading down her back in waves of silver, and she was dressed in what looked like a mix of natural materials, leaves and vines. She didn't speak, but her gaze locked with his, as if she were sizing him up. James couldn't move. He had never seen anything like her before. She was stunning in a way that felt both alien and familiar. His mind raced. Was she native to this planet? Could she help him? She took a slow step forward, and James instinctively took a step back. But she didn't seem threatening. At least not yet. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both waiting to see who would make the first move. Finally, she extended a hand toward him, her expression unreadable. James hesitated. Was she offering help, or was this a trap? But there was no other option. He needed answers, and she was the only one who might have them. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward cautiously, reaching out to her hand. Little did he know, this encounter would mark the beginning of a strange and dangerous journey on this alien planet, one that would change his life forever. The alien's wild nature. James had no idea what to expect as he followed the strange alien woman deeper into the lush jungle. Her long, silver hair trailed behind her like a wave of moonlight, glistening under the alien sun. The vibrant trees around them seemed almost alive, their massive trunks twisting and bending as though they were reaching toward the woman in reverence. The air was thick with the scent of exotic flowers and the faint hum of unseen creatures lurking in the shadows. The woman, who had introduced herself simply as Lyra, moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. She didn't speak much, instead relying on gestures and glances to guide James through the dense forest. Her eyes glowed faintly, illuminating her face in the twilight of the jungle. There was something both unsettling and beautiful about her. James couldn't look away, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Lyra led him to a small clearing, where a crystal-clear stream cut through the vibrant green earth. Strange, large flowers bloomed around it, their petals unfurling as if in greeting. The sight was breathtaking, but James couldn't let himself get too distracted. This was not a vacation spot. This was survival. She knelt by the stream, pulling a few long vines from the ground, twisting them expertly into a makeshift basket. James watched, both fascinated and confused. How could she be so comfortable here? There was no sign of civilization, no signs of other life except for the bizarre creatures that flitted through the underbrush. He cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. Where are we? How long have you been here? Lyra didn't immediately respond. She continued to weave the vines, her hands moving swiftly and skillfully, as if this was something she had done 1,000 times. She only glanced up for a moment, her glowing eyes meeting his, before turning her attention back to the task at hand. James took a deep breath. He was starting to realize that Lyra wasn't exactly like anyone he had met before. She wasn't just a survivor. She was part of this place, a creature of the jungle, as wild and untamed as the planet itself. Lyra finished her work and stood up, presenting the vine basket to James. She gestured for him to follow, so he complied, although his mind raced with questions. Where was she taking him? Was there a way off this planet? And why wasn't she answering his questions? The deeper they went into the jungle, the more bizarre the landscape became. The trees seemed to twist into strange shapes, some of them towering above, their trunks covered in scales, while others had large, glowing flowers growing from their branches, illuminating the path ahead. There was a constant hum in the air, like the planet itself was alive, watching, listening. Finally, they reached a small village, a strange and eerie sight. It wasn't made of traditional materials. Instead, it appeared to be woven from the very fabric of the jungle, the trees and plants having been shaped and manipulated by something far beyond human understanding. The houses were suspended high in the air, connected by twisting vines that hung from the trees like rope bridges. Lyra moved swiftly, almost effortlessly, through the village, making her way to a large structure at the center. It was a towering tree, but unlike any James had ever seen. The trunk was covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly, and the branches stretched wide like the arms of a protective deity. At the base of the tree was a platform, where several more figures stood watching them. They weren't human, but they looked similar to Lyra, tall with glowing eyes and skin the color of deep jade, covered in intricate markings. They all stood motionless, watching him intently, their expressions unreadable. Lyra spoke a few words in a language James didn't understand. The others stepped aside, parting to reveal a small entrance at the base of the tree. Lyra motioned for him to enter, her glowing eyes never leaving his face. James hesitated for a moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had no idea where this was leading, but he had no choice. He couldn't survive out here alone. He stepped forward, and Lyra followed him inside. The interior was nothing like he expected. The inside of the tree was hollow, its walls lined with glowing crystals that cast a soft, soothing light. There were no traditional furnishings, just natural shapes, like woven platforms made from vines, and bowls carved from the wood of the tree itself. It was an alien paradise, one that felt both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. Lyra motioned for him to sit, and James complied. He had been following her for what felt like hours, and he was exhausted. His mind raced with questions, but every time he tried to speak, the words seemed to catch in his throat. It was like the strange beauty of this place was taking away his ability to think clearly. Suddenly, Lyra moved toward him. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers cool against his skin. Her touch was soft, but it sent a strange shiver down his spine. There was power in her, an ancient, untamed force that he couldn't quite understand. She bent down and spoke softly in her language, her voice a strange melody, almost hypnotic. Then she placed a small, smooth stone in his hand. The stone was warm, pulsing with a gentle light. "This is for you," she said in broken English, her voice softer than before. "You are part of this place now." James looked at the stone, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like it was alive in his hand, like it was communicating with him. He looked up at her, a thousand questions swimming in his mind, but before he could ask, she turned and walked away, leaving him to contemplate the strange gift. As he sat there, holding the stone, a sense of unease settled in his chest. What did she mean by part of this place? The deeper he got into this strange world, the more he realized that leaving might not be as simple as it seemed. This planet wasn't just beautiful. It was dangerous, and its wild, untamable nature was beginning to draw him in. And with each passing moment, James began to feel the pull of this planet's ancient power, like it was calling him to stay, forever. Unlikely friendship. Days passed as James settled into the strange, alien rhythm of the jungle. It was a bizarre and unnerving existence, neither peaceful nor hostile, but something in between. Lyra, the wild alien woman who had saved him, continued to guide him through the jungle, teaching him how to survive in ways that were completely alien to him. Every time he thought he understood, something new would happen to make him question everything. The jungle itself seemed alive, shifting in subtle ways, responding to Lyra's movements, as if it were an extension of her. James quickly learned that the plants could be as deadly as they were beautiful. Some trees released toxins into the air when disturbed. Others had fruits that seemed perfectly harmless, but could cause hallucinations or paralysis. But Lyra moved through it all with ease, a part of this world in a way he could never understand. At first, James had resisted. He was a trained astronaut. After all, a man of science, logic, and technology. He had come from a world that was cold, ordered, and predictable. But now, trapped on this unknown planet, surrounded by creatures and plants he couldn't even begin to comprehend, he found himself at a crossroads. Was he a man of reason or a man of survival? The jungle seemed to blur the lines. Every evening, Lyra would guide him to a secluded spot by the crystal-clear stream they had found when they first arrived. There, they would sit, and she would show him how to forage, how to catch food using nothing but his hands and the environment. She was patient, but there was always a wildness in her eyes. She didn't speak much, but the way she communicated with him through gestures and expressions began to build a strange understanding between them. The more time they spent together, the more the barriers between them started to dissolve. She wasn't just a mysterious alien. She was an individual with her own fears and desires. It wasn't long before James found himself questioning everything he knew about her. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he understood. Lyra wasn't just a survivor of this planet. She was something more. There was an intelligence in her actions, a depth in her silence, that suggested she was holding back far more than she was revealing. One night, as they sat by the fire, James finally asked her something he had been wondering since the first time he laid eyes on her. "Lyra," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the night silence. "How long have you been here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into the flames, the flickering light dancing across her face, making her eyes glow even brighter in the darkness. For a long time, she said nothing, her silence pressing against him like a physical weight. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him, her gaze soft but intense. "Long," she said, the word thick with meaning. James didn't press her further, sensing that she wasn't ready to share more. The night stretched on in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their thoughts, yet bound by the invisible thread that had been forming between them since their first meeting. The next day, James woke to find the jungle alive with movement. The air was charged with an unfamiliar energy, and the sounds of distant creatures echoed through the trees, louder than usual. Lyra was nowhere to be seen, but James wasn't worried. He had learned to expect these moments of solitude from her. The woman was as wild as the planet itself, unpredictable, elusive, yet always within reach when needed. He wandered through the jungle, taking in the strange beauty of his surroundings, trying to learn more about this place, trying to understand it. The towering trees, with their bark covered in glowing symbols, seemed to whisper as he passed, as though they were watching him. The air was thick with the scent of moisture, and the ground was soft beneath his feet, almost sponge-like. Then, as he walked, he heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. The sound was close, too close. He stopped in his tracks, heart pounding in his chest. Was it a predator? James' instincts kicked in. He crouched low, silently, listening to the growl that grew louder with each passing second. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was coming. Suddenly, the underbrush exploded in front of him, and a massive, dark figure lunged from the shadows. It was unlike anything James had ever seen, an enormous creature with slick, leathery skin, sharp claws, and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Its jagged teeth flashed as it snarled, and its body was massive, easily 3 times the size of a bear. Before James could react, the creature lunged again. But this time, something moved faster. Lyra appeared out of nowhere, as if she had materialized from the jungle itself. With a speed and grace that defied everything James knew about combat, she stood between him and the creature, holding out her hands in a defensive gesture. Her glowing eyes locked onto the beast's, her stance unyielding. For a moment, the creature hesitated, studying her with a mix of confusion and respect. Then, with a low growl, it backed off slowly, retreating back into the jungle's depths. James couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Lyra had not only protected him, but she had done so effortlessly, almost as if she was part of the jungle itself, able to command the creatures within it. She turned to him, her eyes softening as she spoke. Dangerous, but not today. The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. She was protecting him. In that moment, James realized just how much he had underestimated her. As the days passed, their relationship began to shift. James started to see Lyra not as just a mysterious stranger from another world, but as a partner, a guide in the unknown wilderness. She began to teach him not just about surviving in this strange environment, but about the delicate balance that existed between the creatures of the planet and the people like her who called it home. James couldn't help but admire her more with each passing day. She was wild, untamed, but there was a calm strength in her that made him feel safe in a world that was anything but. And despite everything, the uncertainty, the danger, the isolation, he began to feel something deeper growing between them. It wasn't just survival anymore. There was a bond here, one that transcended words and understanding. In the jungle, amidst the chaos and the beauty, James had found something he hadn't expected, an unlikely friendship with the most dangerous wild creature on the planet. And as the days stretched on, he realized that the only thing more unpredictable than the jungle was the pull he felt toward her. But even in their growing closeness, one question gnawed at him. What was Lyra hiding? The struggle for escape. The days on the alien planet were growing longer, and the jungles more suffocating. Despite the strange beauty of it all, James couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he wasn't meant to stay. The creature's growl still echoed in his mind, a reminder that this world wasn't as welcoming as it appeared. Lyra had shown him how to survive, how to gather food, how to avoid certain dangers. But she hadn't spoken much of the planet's true nature. She kept her secrets close, even as their bond deepened. James knew he couldn't live like this forever. The isolation, the uncertainty, the constant tension in the air, it was wearing him down. His only goal was to fix the ship and leave. But no matter how hard he tried, the wreckage of the Endeavor remained unmovable. The few tools he had salvaged were no match for the complex damage done by the crash. The communication system was beyond repair. His only hope of survival was to find a way off this planet, and Lyra was his only link to it. One evening, after a long day of foraging, James and Lyra sat by the stream. The jungle around them was alive with sound, but to him, it all seemed distant, muffled, like he was hearing it through a thick fog. His thoughts kept returning to the ship and how hopeless it felt to even try to fix it. Lyra, James said quietly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the jungle, is there any way to fix the ship? Anything. Lyra didn't answer immediately, her gaze distant as she ran her fingers over a smooth stone she picked up from the ground. She studied it with intense focus, as though it held the answers to questions that James couldn't even begin to understand. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. The ship? Broken. Not here, she said simply, her eyes flicking toward the wreckage in the distance, a look of finality in her gaze. James clenched his fists, frustration boiling in his chest. But you've been here for years. You must know something. How do we get off this planet? Lyra's eyes flashed, and for a moment, James saw something deeper in them, an emotion he hadn't noticed before. Was it regret? Fear? She opened her mouth to speak but paused, as if considering her words carefully. Then she turned her gaze toward the towering trees, the jungle stretching endlessly in all directions. There are ways, she said slowly, her voice strained. But they are dangerous. No one leaves without paying a price. James frowned. Dangerous? What do you mean? What price? Lyra's lips tightened, her expression turning hard. She didn't answer right away, but James could see that something was weighing on her. The woman who had been so wild and untamed, so fearless in the face of danger, now seemed small, vulnerable in a way that unnerved him. I can show you the path, she finally said, standing up abruptly, but you may not return. You may never leave. James stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. What are you talking about? What's out there? She didn't respond immediately, but instead, she turned and began walking toward the heart of the jungle. James hesitated for a moment, his mind spinning with confusion and fear, but he quickly caught up to her. His instinct told him that this was his chance, the only chance, to escape. If there was a way off this planet, no matter the cost, he had to take it. The jungle grew denser as they moved deeper into the unknown, the air thick with humidity and the scent of unfamiliar plants. The sounds of wildlife grew more distant, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees around them seemed to grow taller, their bark shifting from the bright green they had seen before to a dark, almost black hue. The light dimmed, and the path they were following became narrower, winding through twisted roots and dense vines. James followed Lyra as she moved with purpose, her footsteps silent despite the thick underbrush. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, and for a moment, James had to wonder just how much she had really been hiding from him. The jungle itself seemed to bend to her will, the trees parting as she approached and closing again behind them like a living entity. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone structure, ancient and weathered by time. It was a temple, though it wasn't like anything James had ever seen. The architecture was alien, its design flowing and organic, almost as if it had grown from the very earth itself. Intricate carvings covered the walls, depicting scenes of what looked like battles, rituals, and strange celestial beings. "This is it," Lyra said softly, her voice distant. She stepped forward, her hands trailing over the carvings on the stone, as if they were familiar to her. "This is the way." James could feel his heart racing as he approached. "What is this place?" Lyra turned to him, her expression grave. "A gateway. A place of power. But not for you. You do not belong here." James didn't understand. "What do you mean? This is the only way to escape, isn't it?" Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of sorrow in them. "This place does not let you leave without something in return. It will take what you hold most dear, your past, your memories, your soul." James's blood ran cold. "What are you saying? I don't understand." Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. "There are always consequences. And this place, this gateway, does not forgive." A chill swept through James. He felt the weight of her words settling into his chest like a stone. The hope that had been building inside him began to crumble. He thought he was close to finding a way off this cursed planet. But now, it seemed that the cost was too high. "Is there another way?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and desperation. Lyra stood motionless, her eyes scanning the stone temple, lost in thought. "The planet will not let you go. Not unless it chooses you." Before James could respond, a low, rumbling noise echoed through the jungle. The ground trembled beneath them. A shadow passed over them, followed by a terrifying, high-pitched screech that shattered the silence. Lyra's eyes snapped open wide with recognition. They found us. From the dense trees came the sound of large, heavy footsteps, followed by the unmistakable growls of the creatures that lurked in the shadows. They were no longer alone, and the jungle was about to reveal just how dangerous it truly was. Lyra turned to James, her face hardening. "We need to move. Now." But as the distant sound of the creatures grew louder, James realized that his struggle for escape had just become more deadly than he could have ever imagined. There was no easy way out. Secrets of the planet. The jungle erupted in chaos. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the eerie, blood-curdling growls of something large and predatory. Lyra's eyes flashed with urgency as she grabbed James's arm and pulled him into the dense underbrush. "Move, now," she commanded, her voice sharp with panic, something he had never heard from her before. James didn't hesitate. His mind was still racing, but his body reacted instinctively. He sprinted through the jungle, following Lyra's lead as she navigated the thick, labyrinthine forest with unnerving ease. She knew this land better than anyone. The trees, the ground, the air itself. It was as if the planet whispered to her, guiding her every step. But James was not as fortunate. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to keep up, the alien plants and roots reaching out to trip him. They didn't stop until they had reached a small cave hidden deep within the jungle. The entrance was obscured by thick vines, and Lyra wasted no time pulling them aside and ushering James inside. The moment they entered the cave, she quickly pressed her back to the wall, holding a finger to her lips, signaling him to be silent. James crouched beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. From the darkness of the jungle outside, the growls and screeches grew louder. The creatures were close. James could feel the vibrations in the ground as they passed, their monstrous bodies crashing through the trees. They weren't alone. This jungle was full of predators, creatures that seemed to sense danger in ways that were beyond human comprehension. Lyra's eyes were scanning the shadows, her body tense. She seemed to be waiting for something. And then, with a sudden shift, she turned to James, her voice barely a whisper. "They are not just beasts," she said, her words laced with an unsettling calm. "They are guardians. They protect the power of this planet." James's brow furrowed in confusion. Guardians? Protecting what? What is this place? Lyra didn't respond immediately. She stared out into the darkness, her eyes flicking back and forth, as if listening for something beyond the physical world. The growls of the creatures began to fade, but the tension in the air remained. After a long silence, she finally spoke again, her voice barely audible. "The planet is alive," she said slowly, her eyes locked on his. "Not in the way you understand life. It is a consciousness, a being, and it feeds on those who enter, taking parts of them, until nothing remains. I've tried to escape, but it doesn't let go easily." James's stomach churned. He wanted to ask more, wanted to scream for answers, but the gravity of her words stopped him. The planet wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity with a will of its own. "You said there were ways to leave," James said, his voice tight. "What did you mean by that?" Lyra turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "There are paths, gateways, but they demand a price, a sacrifice. The planet chooses who it keeps and who it lets go, and those who leave rarely remember what they gave." James shook his head, trying to process her words. "What do you mean? People have left before." Lyra's eyes flickered with something, regret, fear, or perhaps a memory long buried. "Long ago, there were others. Like you. Visitors. I watched them come and go, hoping they would succeed. But the planet doesn't give up its secrets easily. It keeps them for itself." The darkness outside the cave grew thicker as the growls of the creatures faded, replaced by an eerie silence. James sat back, his mind whirling. What had he gotten himself into? The planet wasn't just a place of survival. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had designs on him. Lyra's eyes softened as she continued, almost as though she were telling him a story long forgotten. "I was one of the first to arrive. It has been years, but time here is different. It bends in strange ways. The planet shows you what you need to see, but it never tells you everything. It lets you live as long as you believe in the lie. It lets you think that you have a chance, but in the end, you always become part of it." James's mind raced, but a part of him felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was something far deeper. This was a fight for his very soul. The silence in the cave stretched, and James realized that he had been holding his breath. The jungle outside had fallen eerily still, as if waiting for something to happen. "Lyra," James began, his voice breaking the silence. "What happened to the others? What happened to the ones who tried to escape?" Lyra's gaze shifted away, her eyes distant. "They became part of the jungle, part of the planet. You see, the planet has a way of taking what it needs. Memories. Souls. The deeper you go, The more you lose of yourself, the more you become a part of its eternal cycle. The weight of her words crushed him. He had hoped that there was a way out, that he could return to Earth. But now, the price seemed too high. "Can we escape?" James asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Lyra didn't answer at first. She just looked at him with those glowing eyes, and for a moment, he felt as if she could see every thought, every fear, every hidden part of him. "There is a way," she said finally, her voice heavy with the burden of truth. "But it's not just about leaving the planet. It's about leaving everything behind. The memories, the past. You will forget everything, everything you were, everything you loved." James felt the weight of her words settling on him like a stone in his chest. The planet wanted to take more than just his life. It wanted to consume him, to strip him of everything that made him who he was. And in exchange for escape, it would demand his very soul. Lyra stood up slowly, her silhouette blending with the shadows. She turned toward the entrance of the cave, her voice a whisper as she spoke one final time. "If you leave, you will never be the same. The planet doesn't let go without a cost. But if you stay, it will consume you completely. There is no easy way out." With those words, she disappeared into the jungle, leaving James alone with the terrifying reality of what lay ahead. The decision he had to make was no longer just about survival. It was about his very essence. The planet wasn't just trying to keep him here. It was trying to make him part of it forever. The choice. The air felt thicker now, charged with an energy that James could no longer ignore. He sat in the cave, staring at the glowing stone Lyra had given him, now pulsing with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic light. The planet seemed to hum beneath his feet, alive, aware of his every thought. The weight of Lyra's words hung heavy in his mind. There is no easy way out. The realization struck him harder than the crash itself. He wasn't just fighting to survive on an alien world. He was fighting to retain himself. For the first time, James felt the true isolation of being stranded on this planet. It wasn't just the physical distance from Earth. It was the spiritual distance, the creeping sensation that every moment here stripped away a part of who he was. Every decision, every action seemed to carry a consequence that wasn't just immediate but eternal. Was he even still the same man who had crashed here days ago? The night was drawing in, and the jungle outside the cave had settled into a heavy silence. The moon, or what passed for the moon here, cast a pale, eerie glow over the jungle floor. It wasn't the kind of quiet that soothed the soul. It was the kind of silence that warned of something worse to come. He couldn't stay here. Not in this cave. Not in this place. James rose to his feet, the stone in his hand still pulsing softly as if it knew what he was about to do. He knew what had to be done. The temple. The gateway. He had to go there, despite the warnings, despite the price. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But as he took a step toward the exit, a voice stopped him. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it chilled him to the bone. "Leaving will cost you more than you think." Lyra appeared from the shadows, her figure almost blending with the darkness of the cave. Her glowing eyes seemed brighter now, almost too bright, like twin moons in the night. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice almost tender. "You think you can leave. You think you can take the easy way out. But the planet doesn't give you that choice. It never does." James clenched the stone in his hand, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. He had come to trust Lyra, and yet there was something different about her now. She wasn't the wild, untamed creature he had met days ago. Something had shifted in her. A part of her had become the jungle. It was as if her connection to this place was so deep, so ingrained, that it had overtaken her. "I don't want to stay here," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been stuck here for too long. I can't just let this place consume me." Lyra took a step forward, her face unreadable, her expression almost distant. "You think you can escape without consequence. But leaving the way you want to, you will leave nothing behind. Not your memories, not your feelings. Everything that made you who you are will be taken. James's chest tightened. What are you saying? Are you telling me there's no way out at all? Lyra's eyes softened, the glow dimming slightly as she reached out, touching his shoulder gently. There is a way, but it isn't easy. The planet will demand a sacrifice from you. It will ask for your soul or your memories. It takes what it needs to let you leave. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His memories, his soul, that was the price. That was the cost of leaving this place. His mind raced. His life, his experiences, everything he had worked for, they would all be gone. Was he willing to trade his memories, his very identity, for the chance to escape this living nightmare? He could barely stand the thought of losing his past, his humanity. I can't lose who I am, James whispered, his voice trembling. He turned away from Lyra, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. But then, just as quickly, the thought of never leaving this place, the thought of becoming part of the jungle, part of the planet, sent a spike of fear through him. He couldn't stay here forever. He couldn't let this place take everything from him. I have to try, he said, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't known he still had. He turned to face Lyra again, his eyes searching hers for some sign of hope, some sign that there might be another way. Lyra's gaze softened, a sadness in her eyes. She nodded slowly, as if she had already known this would be his choice. Then go, she said quietly. Go to the temple. But remember, when the planet asks for its price, you will have no choice. It will take from you what you hold most dear. It always does. James didn't look back as he left the cave. He couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. The weight of the stone in his hand felt heavier now, almost as though it was drawing him closer to the temple, to the gateway that promised escape. The jungle seemed to part for him as he moved, the trees shifting like the planet was guiding him toward his destiny. But the deeper he ventured, the more he felt the pull of the planet. The closer he got to the temple, the more the air seemed to thicken, the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. The temple loomed ahead, an imposing structure now bathed in the light of the strange moon. Its carvings seemed to come alive in the moonlight, twisting and changing with every step James took. It felt alive, watching him as he approached. As he crossed the threshold, the ground beneath his feet vibrated, and a low hum echoed through the air. The planet was aware of him now. There was no turning back. Inside, the air was thick with an energy that was both powerful and unsettling. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, glowing faintly with an ethereal light. At its base, a deep chasm seemed to open into the very core of the planet. This was the gateway. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. As he placed the glowing stone on the pedestal, a voice, ancient and deep, resounded in his mind. What will you give to leave? The words echoed through his mind, a question that had no easy answer. James's breath hitched as he reached into his chest, a deep primal fear rising inside him. The planet's will was stronger than anything he had ever known. The voice returned, softer this time, as if it were coaxing him. What is more precious than the past you carry? James stood frozen. His past, his life, his memories, the people he had loved. Was he willing to sacrifice it all to escape? Could he bear the thought of walking away without any trace of who he was? He closed his eyes, his breath shallow. He had come this far. He could not turn back now. He had to make a choice. The future he wanted was within his grasp. But was it worth the price? And as the ancient voice whispered once more, James realized the truth. The price of escape was not just his soul, but the very essence of who he had been. Freedom or forever. The room was silent now, save for the soft hum of the energy filling the air. The planet itself seemed to pulse, vibrating through James's very bones, as though it were waiting for him to make his final choice. The glowing stone on the pedestal flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, twisting the carvings into grotesque, ever-changing shapes. It was as if the temple was alive, watching, judging, ready to take what it wanted. James stood before the stone, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the decision pressing on him like a vice. What was he willing to sacrifice? The question echoed in his mind, a constant refrain that drowned out everything else. He thought of Earth, his home, his family, the life he had left behind. But most of all, he thought of the man he had been before he crash-landed here, the man who had loved, who had lived, who had dreamed of the stars. But that man felt like a distant memory now, lost in the overwhelming power of the planet. The time he had spent on this world had changed him, slowly stripping away parts of his humanity, replacing them with something darker, deeper. Was it worth it? Would the memories of his past, his life on Earth, be enough to keep him grounded in this place? Or would he let them go, as Lyra had warned, to escape this alien nightmare? The voice in his mind returned, deep and commanding. Choose now, traveler. The price is set. The path is open. James took a deep breath, feeling the cold air of the temple fill his lungs. He could feel it, feel the pull of the planet, its invisible hands tightening around his chest. It wanted him to stay, to become part of it. He could almost hear the whispers now, urging him to accept the bargain, to forget the world he had come from, to embrace the endless cycle that the planet offered. But in that moment, something within him snapped. He wasn't ready to lose himself. Not yet. He stepped forward, the stone pulsing beneath his touch, and with a final desperate push, placed his palm against the glowing surface. The world around him seemed to blur, the temple walls spinning as the energy around him crackled with power. The voice in his mind spoke again, but this time, it was softer, almost mournful. You have chosen, traveler. But know this, what you leave behind will never be regained. For a brief moment, James felt an intense wave of grief flood over him, as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. His memories, the faces of those he loved, the moments he cherished, everything he had once held dear. It all began to fade, like smoke dissipating into the wind. He tried to hold on to them, but it was like grasping at shadows. They slipped away, fading into the ether. Then, as quickly as it began, the feeling stopped. The temple, the planet's energy, the weight of his decision. It all disappeared. He stood alone in the center of the chamber, the stone now dark and lifeless beneath his palm. The air was still, the jungle outside silent. It was done. James blinked, confusion clouding his mind. His body felt lighter, as though something had been taken from him. His past, his memories, everything before the crash, seemed distant, fragmented. He tried to grasp at the fleeting images in his mind, but they slipped away like water through his fingers. There was nothing left but the present. He stood there for a long time, the silence pressing down on him. The decision had been made. The price had been paid. But was it worth it? The temple's entrance now stood open before him, the dense jungle stretching beyond. James felt the pull to leave, to escape this place, but something in the back of his mind whispered that he would never truly be free. Even as he walked through the gateway, a part of him understood that the planet would never fully release him. He had left his past behind, but it had taken something more from him in return, his identity, the essence of who he had been. As he walked through the jungle, the world around him seemed different. The trees were no longer just trees. They were part of a living organism, interconnected, reaching out to him. The air, once oppressive, now felt lighter. The hum of the planet had faded, but it still lingered in his mind like a haunting melody. And then he saw her. Lyra stood ahead of him, her form bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the moon. She was waiting for him, as though she had known this moment would come. Her eyes, glowing with that familiar intensity, met his with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "You're free," she said softly, her voice almost wistful. "But you're not the same." James's chest tightened as he looked at her. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain what had happened, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. He didn't even know who he was anymore. His thoughts felt fragmented, distant. He wanted to remember. He wanted to hold onto his past, but it was like trying to hold onto smoke. Lyra stepped closer, her hand reaching out toward him. I told you the price would be high. But the planet never lets go without taking something in return. You can leave, but you will never be the man you were. James swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He couldn't deny it. He was free. He had escaped the planet's grasp. But in doing so, he had lost something he could never regain. His memories, his connection to the past. Gone. He looked at Lyra one last time, the woman who had guided him, who had shared this strange and dangerous world with him. He saw the sadness in her eyes, the same sorrow that now echoed in his own heart. They were both survivors of the same planet, both changed by it, but in different ways. Do you regret it? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture that was both comforting and final. No, she said quietly. Because you chose, and that's all we can ever do. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the jungle, leaving James standing alone under the strange alien sky. He had his freedom. He had escaped the planet. But what was left of him? Was it really freedom if you had lost everything that made you who you were? As James walked into the unknown, the jungle behind him seemed to whisper, almost like a warning, and he couldn't help but wonder if the price of freedom had been too high.